Well, I think the correlation of religion and politics is improper in our country. If it means that there's any expression by an incumbent president or even a candidate of a preference for one religion over another. And although we have a very large Christian community, and I am a Christian, I'm an evangelical Christian. As you say, I teach the Bible every Sunday when I'm home. I think that the separation of church and state is a very important element of our society that should be restored, not preserved because it's violated quite often now. But there was a melding of the right-wing, very conservative religious community and the right-wing, very conservative Republican Party about 25 or 30 years ago. And that still is an important factor. But I think it's less important now than it was 5 or 6 years ago.
Really? Because,
yes,
I mean, if we look at the Republican lineup for the presidential, and it's still very much in the mix, but if you look at Governor Rick Perry of Texas, sure. I mean, this is going some.
I know, but they're not going to win.
But you don't need me to tell you that these are awful times economically for many
Well, they are
Americans.
In our country and also in Europe. There's no doubt about that.
And that opens up a kind of ugly space, a space where people are looking for messianic leaders, if you like.
That's true. And there are radical elements that are building up both in my country and yours. I think we've basically in the last few years abandoned, for instance, the growing commitment to deal with global warming. That's almost a dead issue now. There's nobody much talking about it. And in our country, the main target of people who are attacked in the Republican Party, at least, are immigrants. And of course, throughout almost every country in Europe, there's an aversion now that's really a new coming and very disturbing trend to condemn people who haven't been living here for a long time as intruders who might compete for a job. So I think that's an element of racial prejudice that has intruded itself upon the political system and the social system as a result, perhaps, of a weakened economic system.
You say you're confident that President Obama will win. You see, I'm wondering whether you don't feel a sense of disappointment, because many of the causes that you really espouse and have worked tirelessly ever since you became president, and even when you were president,
yes, have
in some ways fallen down on his watch. And I would raise most specifically the matter of Isreal and Palestine.
Yes. You want me to comment on that?
I do. I'm wondering, I'm wondering, for example, I mean, I imagine you would absolutely have stood by his view yes, that there should be no more settlements built in Palestinian territory.
I was very excited when President Obama went to Cairo and said that a policy of my nation and my government is no more Israeli settlements in Palestine. And this sent a wave of hope and aspirations for the Palestinians finally to get some basic political and human rights. And of course, it was rejected in its totality by the Netanyahu regime. And then I was also encouraged this past May when President Obama repeated the policy that all his predecessors have had since Israel was a nation, since 1967 at least, that Israel should withdraw from the occupied territories except for the 1967 borders modified. And apparently he's abandoned that as well. Now, when he made his recent speech in the United Nations, there was no mention of 67 borders. And I think this...
So what do you think is happening?
I think it's the political pressures within our country from the supporters of Israel. And I'm a supporter of Israel, I might add to say. My hope, my number one international dream and prayer has been to bring peace to Israel. I was involved in the so-called Geneva Accords. In fact, I was involved in the negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and I made the keynote speech at Geneva when it was announced. And it called for leaving half of the Israelis settlers in Palestine in exchange for some property of Israel that would go to the Palestinians to modify the borders. And when I was speaking on the last time, I had a long discussion with Ariel Sharon, very conservative prime minister, as you know. Sharon had accepted that premise. In fact, he pointed out to me a very intriguing idea. He said, why doesn't Israel give to the Palestinians a land corridor between Gaza and the West Bank, which is about 36 miles, and let them build on that corridor a railroad and a highway. It'll be owned by the Palestinians as a land swap, and the Israelis will maintain security. And when the Israelis want to go from one part of the Negev desert to another, they would just go under a tunnel or over a bridge and let the Palestinians have that land. So all of the predecessors of Netanyahu have accepted the premise that Israel must give up the occupied territories in order to have peace. This is what everybody knows as a two-state solution. Netanyahu and Lieberman and others are now moving inevitably, apparently to me, to a one-state solution where there's only going to be one nation between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, controlled ostensibly by the Jews, the Israelis. But this can't last.
A state about which you dared to conjure the word apartheid.
That's the prospect. Yeah, that's what's going to happen. So you're either going to have, right now there are a majority of non-Jews in that one state, but they're not a majority of non-Jewish voters yet because the Palestinians are younger in age. But it's just a few years before there'll be a majority of non-Jews in that one state area. And Israel will be faced with an impossible choice. Either have part of their citizens deprived of a right of citizenship, that is the non-Jews, or to let the Arabs outvote the Jews in their own country. So you can see this is inevitably moving toward a tragedy, in my opinion, for Israel. But apparently that's what Netanyahu is trying to do.
There is another side to the equation, and that, of course, is the preparedness by Hamas and others to accept the right of Israel to exist.
They're all prepared to do that. The Carter Center is one of the few organizations in the world that deals with all the aspects of the peace process in the Middle East, with Israel, with Lebanon, with Jordan, with Syria, with Egypt, and with Hamas, and also with Fatah, of course. And all of the Arab countries, as you know, have made the so-called Arab peace proposal to recognize Israel diplomatically and an equal trading partner if Israel will just do what I just said, withdraw basically to the 67 borders. And Hamas leadership have announced publicly and told me privately that they will accept Israel's existence within the 67 borders modified by negotiation. They've also said that they would anoint Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the PLO, to be their representative negotiator. And they will accept any deal negotiated by Abbas with Israel, provided the Palestinians have a right to vote on it in a referendum and approve the results of the negotiation. So I think there's adequate flexibility on the Arab side, and in the past there has been flexibility on the Israeli side. Now, apparently, that flexibility is gone.
Where does all this in you come from? I mean, how did somebody who grew up in what was a very segregated state, was a southern state?
Sure.
How did you emerge as somebody who wanted an end to racial discrimination and who was prepared to countenance all sorts of international settlements like Israel-Palestine that many other people in America just can't cope with?
Well, two things. One is that, as I say, I teach the Bible every Sunday when I'm home. Half the time in the New Testament, half the time in the Hebrew text, the Old Testament. So I'm familiar with biblical history and with geography and so forth. But I think the racial issue about which you asked, I grew up in a community called Archery, about 2.5 miles outside the little town of Plains, which has about 600 people. There were 200 people in Archery. We didn't have any white neighbors. All my neighbors were African American, were black people. So I grew up in a culture of the black community. I wrote a book about that called An Hour Before Daylight, which is still on sale, by the way. And
the BBC does not allow commercials.
I didn't make a commercial, no. Just an announcement. But at the end of the book, I tried to think of the 5 people in my life, other than my mother and father, that shaped my life. And only 2 of those people were white. So I was immersed in a black culture as a child until I was 12 or 13 years old. My mother was a registered nurse, a member of the medical profession, and she never paid any attention to racial segregation or racial distinction. So I think it was that realization on my part as an evolving adult that legal segregation under the Supreme Court ruling and the congressional action and so forth was a millstone not only around the neck of my black neighbors, but a millstone around the white people who were imposing our will on these people whom we considered to be inferior. And I knew from biblical teaching, my religion, and my mother, that we were not superior and they were not inferior.
Your family were peanut farmers. I mean,
Still is.
Still are. And I'm wondering how, from this very small nut and its production, you found your way to becoming governor of Georgia and president of the United States. I mean, you must be a very ambitious, very competitive man. That must be your downside.
Well,
but you are competitive, aren't you? Somebody said, I think it was Hamilton Jordan, said, your campaign manager, that you thought you could probably make a better turkey noise than a turkey.
well, yeah, some people said they look at a calendar and I look at a watch, but, but yes, I have always had an inclination, if I thought a goal was worthwhile, like at the Carter Center, you know, we devote our full time to making sure that that prospect of success, although it might be remote, comes into reality, so I don't mind competing if I think the goal is proper.
I've enumerated your, well, some of your extraordinary achievements as president, but were you a good president, and would you be a better one now? Leaving out the question of age.
Yes.
Which is irrelevant.
Yes.
Would you be a better president now than you were?
No, I don't think so. This is a difficult time for any president. And it's an unprecedented political atmosphere in my country. It never has prevailed before, except perhaps during the Civil War when we were actually in conflict between the North and South. But there's a polarization in my country that is totally unprecedented. And it's brought about by the massive infusion of money into the political structure of America. You couldn't possibly expect now to be the Democratic or Republican nominee unless you could raise $200, $300, $400 million. Obama will probably raise $1 billion. When I ran for president against Gerald Ford, we didn't accept any contributions. In America, there was a law then and now that every taxpayer could put a little check mark on his income tax, and it's $2. So he and Ford and I both, and later Reagan and I both, ran without any contributions. Our Supreme Court of the United States, let's see, January before last, made the stupidest decision that the Supreme Court has ever made by ruling, in effect, that corporations are people, and there's absolutely no limit on how much a corporation can give to political candidates. Even corporations in our country that have foreign ownership, they can give as much money as they want to any candidate, and they don't have to be revealed publicly where the funds derive. So this is meant now that people who are incumbent, who have some vote to sell in the future or in office, have a plethora of money. And in almost every campaign now, the #1 project is to tear down the personal reputation of your opponent, the negative advertising. And although most American voters say we don't pay any attention to we don't like negative advertising, it really works. So that polarization at the local level carries over into Washington. This is unprecedented in our country.
Your presidency ended in the appalling hostage crisis.
Yes.
444 days.
I remember.
I was actually in Tehran for much of that time. And I wondered, you're a man of religion, how did you feel about Iran immediately after you left office? They bamboozled you out of office in many ways.
Well, I don't blame you for that, but after the Shah was overthrown, I thought it was proper for me to have diplomatic relations with the revolutionary government, with the Ayatollah's government, and I did. They had a large number of diplomats in Washington. I had, as you know, a large number of diplomats in Tehran. And I really don't believe personally that the Ayatollah knew ahead of time that the militant students were going to take our embassy and capture our hostages. Later, though, it evolved, as you know, into a long period of time. But I thought when I left office and now, that the United States should have diplomatic relations with Iran. And within the bounds of propriety and diplomatic niceties, that we should have maximum communication between Washington and Tehran. I still feel that way, because I believe that the human rights abuses in Iran could be lessened by beneficial United States influence. We're powerful enough to withstand, reaching out a hand of friendship, even though sometimes it may be rebuffed.
Do you think that the world's response and America's response to 9/11 was right?
At the beginning it was, yes. I think that immediately after 9/11, we had almost unanimous expressions of condolence and support from around the world, including in Tehran, by the way. But we have made serious mistakes since then. The worst mistake was when George W. Bush decided to invade Iraq, which I strongly opposed. I think that it was proper for the United States to go into Afghanistan because that's where Al-Qaeda had solidified its presence and support from the Taliban government and so forth. I think we had to go in and remove the threat of Taliban strength. After that, instead of looking toward Iraq with totally false premises, and I think the leaders knew that they were false at the time, we should have stayed in Afghanistan and used a tiny portion of the money we've spent in Iraq to rebuild Afghanistan.
And now, I mean, how would you see extricating from Afghanistan? Do you believe that the
sooner the better.
Well, but do you believe the current assassination of targeted individuals by drone is a right thing?
It's not something that I would have done, but I'm really not in a position to criticize President Obama for his decision. I don't want to be in that position.
And the killing of Osama bin Laden?
I think that was probably justified, yes. Osama bin Laden had deliberately killed more than 3,000 of my own fellow citizens. I think he deserved to be killed, yes.
Do you think America has understood the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan?
I know one of us has. I think there's a general premise. I would say a majority of Americans now, looking back on the lies that were told about the situation in Iraq concerning weapons of mass destruction, I think now see that Iraqi invasion was a mistake, yes.
How do you view the Arab Spring?
With surprise and excitement and pleasure and uncertainty about the future. The Carter Center will be helping with the election in Tunisia very soon. I was on the telephone last week with the Field Marshal Tantawi of Egypt. They are moving toward an election for parliament first, then the draft of a new constitution, the election of a president in 2013. Do
you feel slightly uneasy about Egypt? I mean, the army is still in control.
In a way, I'm familiar with the army leaders, and as you probably know, ever since the time of Nasser and Sadat and also Mubarak, the army has been in charge in Egypt of military, political, and economic and finance. The army's been totally dominant in all those respects. And I think that the military leadership now, I don't know them all, of course, I don't know many of them. I think they want to adhere to their position of dominance, not only in the military, but also to maintain their economic superiority. I think they'll give up as little political power as they can possibly do.